Hello, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this In Conversation, hosted here at Queen's University Belfast tonight at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. You're all very welcome. My name's Richard English, I'm Director of the Mitchell Institute, and it's a real privilege for me to introduce our distinguished guest tonight, Andrew Heyn, Honorary Professor of Practice at the Mitchell Institute here at Queen's. Andrew Heyn was a UK diplomat for more than 30 years. He served as British Consul General in Hong Kong between 2016 and 2020, and British Ambassador to Myanmar from 2009 to 2013. Andrew was previously Deputy British Ambassador in Dublin between 2005 and 2009, the period which covered the St Andrews Agreement. He's now a regular speaker and media expert commentator on Myanmar, on Hong Kong, and on wider foreign policy issues. He was awarded a CMG in 2020 and an OBE in 2013. Today we'll begin the session with some questions from me to Professor Heyn. Then there'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you would post those questions, please, through the question and answer feature on the screens in front of you. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can during the session. Andy, it's great to have you with us tonight. It's great to have you as an Honorary Professor of Practice in the Mitchell Institute. I'm going to begin with Ireland. I know that you had some personal connections and links to Northern Ireland preceding your time in Dublin, but it's also true that your time in Dublin was an important phase. I think it's fair to say probably more amicable relationships between London and Dublin during that period, but also, as I said, that was the period when the St Andrews Agreement developed, a very important development in the long peace process. Could you talk about your experiences in relation to your Irish phase of your work?
Sure, yeah, I'm very happy to. And thank you very much for inviting me to appear on this tonight and for the invitation to be an honorary professor at the Mitchell Institute, which is an enormous honour for me, and I'm very grateful for that. The Dublin posting at a personal level was something which I was delighted to get, because I have, as you mentioned, my family are from this part of the world. My mum and dad are both from Belfast. My wife is from Glenarm, and so there'd always been this sort of centrifugal force drawing me towards the island, and so we were absolutely delighted to get the posting. And as you say, it was a very good time to be posted to Dublin for a British diplomat. You don't have to think very far back to think of times when the relationship was extremely difficult, and clearly at the moment there are issues as well. But arriving there in 2005, things were actually in a really good place. So the relationship between the Taoiseach, then Bertie Ahern, and Tony Blair as Prime Minister was excellent. Their offices worked really well and closely together. We had a whole range of things going on, and I was also Director for Trade and Investment there as well as Deputy Ambassador. So trade was flourishing between the two places, and the political relationship was very good. But there was, as it were, an elephant in the room, which was that the power-sharing institutions here were in Northern Ireland were suspended, I think from 2002, so the time I'd arrived they'd been suspended for a while. And so the effort to try to get to revitalise the Good Friday Agreement was a major issue, but it wasn't an issue of conflict between, certainly in the view we had from the embassy, there wasn't an issue of conflict between the two governments. It was an issue where actually they were working extremely hard to try to get it reinstated.
And the St Andrews Agreement was a significant milestone in making it more easy for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998 to be more acceptable to more people. Was there a sense at the time, Andrew, that it was a major part of the peace process jigsaw being put into place?
Absolutely. And you could see it both at the time, and I think the thing that made it so extraordinary in a way was that it was actually unexpected as well, and the enormous amount of work, and it might be something we could develop later on in this exchange, but the enormous amount of work that was going in Dublin, in Belfast, in London to try to get something, but actually the political backdrop to it was really unpromising. And the thing that was extraordinary, I think if everybody had been thinking, yeah, actually this meeting at St Andrews could result in something like the St Andrews Agreement, it would have still been pretty amazing. But the fact that we weren't expecting anything, and then we got an agreement out of there. And of course, it still took some implementation from there, but that implementation happened. And the transformation was extraordinary, because what was really interesting, and the bit that I find really interesting is looking, I've seen it from when you're working overseas. Now, this time I happen to be in Dublin, but people talk about the Good Friday Agreement in a way when you're overseas that reminds you just how groundbreaking it was, because the image of Northern Ireland was of a troubled place, and that was a global image with insuperable political difficulties and entrenched positions. And then the Good Friday Agreement happened. It was, oh my goodness, this is a really hopeful period. And then it didn't work. And again, it was saying, well, perhaps these differences, despite all the political will and effort and diplomatic skill and went into it. And then I remember coming up on the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I represented the embassy in an event here in Belfast, and you might have been at it, Richard. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was at it. And if you ever needed an illustration of just how extraordinary and how important it was, he gave it when he talked about how he had come across at the time of the Holy Cross schools protests and all the went around that. He'd been part of a fact-finding group that came in. And he talked to, I mean, you could see he had the room in his hand as he said, I saw a hatred I hadn't seen in their entrenched positions I'd never seen. And this is, somebody who's gone through what he's gone through. And then I'll do an awful Desmond Tutu impression, but he then said, and now we see Mr. Paisley and Mr. McGuinness hugging and embracing, and the message for the world is one of hope. And I found that when I when I was serving as ambassador in Myanmar, we had a joint delegation with members of the unionist side and the national side who came out to Myanmar to try to help use their experience to help the ethnic groups there. When I got to Hong Kong and people heard about my Northern Ireland background, oh yes, we had Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness here, it was amazing. I mean, it really was absolutely, it changed the weather in a really serious way.
And there are so many themes there of real importance, I think, Andy, in what you're saying. The unexpected nature of major change, the non-inevitable quality of it in 1998, also in 2006, the relationships at the heart of it, and also the tendency maybe for us to take for granted a bit in Northern Ireland the enormity of the peace process which was secured, which, as some people in other conflicts around the world would say, however flawed it seems to you in Belfast, it's a huge achievement when viewed from other parts of the world. So there's a lot of global themes there in that Irish and British-Irish story. You were then in Myanmar during another period of dramatic change, 2009 to 2013, in some way very different challenges being faced. Could you talk us through some of the things that were occurring then and the dynamics involved and how you responded to them? Yeah,
I mean, that was an extraordinary time and compounded by the fact that normally when you head out to a posting, there's a gap. So I would have normally finished in Dublin and then a few months and gone out to Myanmar. But just with the way the FCO logistics turned out at that point, I left Dublin on a Friday night and took up my first job as an ambassador on Monday morning in Rangoon, and you talk about culture shocks. I mean, the Myanmar, we called it Burma then because in line with what Aung San Suu Kyi had asked for, but I'll interchange, if I may, Burma and Myanmar throughout this. As we travelled in from the airport, having left a cosmopolitan city like Dublin, as you travelled in from the airport, we knew it would be different. But, roads that were dark and potholed, you'd see these shacks by the side of the road with low-level sodium lights. When we got to where we were going to be living, the ambassador's house, the staff who greeted us, you could tell, were not just nervous because a new boss was in town, but nervous about what they might say because they didn't know who was listening to amongst their group, who might be listening and reporting back what I might say, what they might say. And it was my first experience of what totalitarian rule is like. And then, again, unexpectedly, it opened up. And it wasn't this was not a linear, it started in the late about October, November of 2010. This wasn't a linear process that led to the elections in 2015. It bumped up and down, and at times we thought it wasn't going to happen. But what I do remember, and is I think really important in the foreign policy context, is the day that Aung San Suu Kyi was released, and I went down to join the crowd at University Avenue where she was released from house arrest, was this explosion of joy and hope, and the hope underlined that she had. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people to see her. And you realize then how important what she stood for was, and what she stood for was government by consent. There are lots of other things, but ultimately it was an accountable government, a democratically elected government the rule of law and personal freedoms. And all of that was one we may want to talk more about Aung San Suu Kyi later, but all of that was encapsulated in her. And it made you realize when you saw that the thing that I'd taken for granted, when you see it, what it means to people and how important those things are.
And that moment of hope, there have been troubles since then in terms of the dynamics of the country. Could you talk a little bit about the evolution of that? Not just during the period you were there, Andy, but I mean, I've read pieces by you in the papers analysing more recent developments in Myanmar.
Yeah, it's very complex. The issue with the intercommunal violence between the local Buddhist population in Rakhine State and the Muslim Rohingya group began it had happened previously, but it reignited during my time there, but not to the extent of subsequent years. So I was down in Rakhine State several times, and what you saw there was, again, there was a real comparison actually with what happened in the Balkans, in that you had two communities, in this case, who'd actually lived side by side and rubbed along, and there was some frictions, but basically they had made it work. And then when the military started to take their hand off the tiller, you saw that these tensions were not controlled anymore, and you had people very deliberately, frankly, not on the Rohingya side, on the armed forces side, stirring this up. So what happened there was suddenly it erupted, and all of these old issues around identity and whether the Rohingya had the right to be there in the first place, and the fact that many of them have been there for generation after generation, was gone. These were all if you went to one extreme, these were all illegal immigrants, and they were all non-Buddhists, and this was an issue for those who were trying to create a problem with that. And the ones who were trying to create that problem more than anyone else or any other group were the armed forces, because they saw this as an issue where they could get, I'm afraid, a lot of popular support, and they could also make Aung San Suu Kyi's life extremely difficult. Now, this is not to say that she doesn't bear responsibility, her share of the responsibility for what happened, but make no mistake, the people who are in charge right now in Burma after the military coup earlier this year are the same people who stirred this up. These are the people who killed in many cases, members of the Rohingya people, but swept so many of them out. I mean, there's a figure of 750,000 now, seems to be the accepted figure now in Bangladesh. And as I say, I'm not trying to excuse the part that Aung San Suu Kyi played in this, but this was a very cynical play by the government and a very political play.
Thank you very much. Let's chat next, if we may, about Hong Kong. You arrived there, I think, in September 2016. 2016 was a year of huge change. The Brexit referendum of that year, significant development for the UK, for Ireland, for Europe. Shortly after you arrived in Hong Kong, the election of President Trump indicated another kind of significant international, global development. And there also, obviously, during the time you were there in Hong Kong, Andy, there were major developments in Hong Kong and also in the relationship between the West and China. I wonder if you could say something about the challenges of diplomatic work in that kind of highly charged, very fluid situation.
Yeah, it was in all three of the postings we're talking about here. I walked into one thing and ended up somewhere else, or working in a very different environment. And it's quite, talk about be careful what you wish for, because as a diplomat, what you want is a place where things are happening, which are of interest to your home government. But I didn't quite expect the dramas of Myanmar and Hong Kong, that you would be right in the center of the place that's right at the center of the storm. And what was particularly interesting, actually, in the case of Hong Kong when the protest movement started, was that I started my diplomatic career in Venezuela in 1991 in Caracas, and there the means of communication back home, you had telegrams. Now, telegrams had to be used, they had to be pretty important for London basically to be instructing you to do something. They would send a telegram, which didn't take much longer than an email to arrive. But in a place like Caracas, you'd probably get 1-2 a week. You would then have the standard way of communication was a letter from the ambassador or the first secretary political or whoever via the diplomatic bag, which you put into the bag, and it took a week to get to London. London would then work on it, and then they'd send it back. So probably about a 3-week turnaround. telephone contact was difficult, partly because Venezuela's phone system was pretty bad, but it was just different then. Fast forward then 30 years into Hong Kong, and what you have is you have a 24-hour news cycle. You have ministers. You've got a time difference, as you had in Venezuela, but a time difference that means that when it's, let's say, early evening in Hong Kong or mid-afternoon, the ministers are appearing on the morning TV shows or the lunchtime news, and they need to be have absolutely up-to-date information. You've got social media firing out all sorts of things which their advisors are reading and saying, what's this report of a guy getting shot, wherever it is. So we ended up in a situation, and the other thing was actually, just to complete this picture, is that the protests intensified at the weekends. So they were bubbled under during the week, and then they would intensify at the weekends, which meant that in the consulate, we had a team which varied in size depending on the intensity of what was going on, but over a period of the best part of certainly of 6 months, where you're working 7 days a week, you're working 18 hours a day to feed this machine that needs, and it's not just the ministerial briefings. In the midst of this, obviously you've got to feed in your policy advice. I was lucky to have an absolutely amazing team in Hong Kong people who really stepped up to the plate and worked and so hard to deliver that. But the thing that was really striking about it was how important social media was, and how what was being reported, because there were journalists all over the place, be they from the BBC or Sky or any of those international networks, and they were making the weather, and that was what the ministers were having to react to, as well as a very difficult to, it was a popular protest with it was a leaderless protest, so it made it very challenging. It was, as a diplomat, fascinating to be part of it and to see and to have a ringside seat and to be reporting on it. But it just demonstrated how full-on an experience like that is.
And does it make what you're describing, Andy, does that make sustained foreign policy more difficult to sustain because you're responding to a far greater number of unpredictable, heterogeneous, multiply originating pressures through social media, through the speed of communication? Or does the capacity for that fast communication make it easier than the telegram and phone call that are less frequent?
I think you're right, it cuts both ways. And clearly the advantage is you can do the real-time reporting, analysis and policy. I think the bit that makes it more difficult is that you can end up actually being very reactive, because you have got social media, the impact of that, not to mention this 24-hour news cycle. And that can drive, this is what ministers are having, when they're sat in front of doing a much more harder interview than this, under pressure from a paxman, they're having to make sure they're briefed, and they know about the social media film that's just popped up on Instagram, if that's where films pop up, that shows police and protesters clashing and what happened there. So I think the worry I would have is that it can, and you saw it during that period, that you actually at times you needed to take a step back. You need to think, hang on, where is this headed? But actually you were having to deal much more with the immediate.
Yeah. I'm going to come to the aggressive Jeremy Paxman questions in a minute. There's going to be one more question from me, and then we're going to move to questions from the audience. A number of questions are coming in. To those people who are joining us in the audience, please do post questions for Andrew Heyn in the question and answer part of the screen in front of you, and we'll try and get through as many of those in a minute as we can. But Andy, the last question from me develops the reflections you've just been offering on your Foreign Office career over a long and distinguished period. Does the changes technically in the way that the business has changed because of technology and so forth, but there's also in the period since you began your career been a significant difference in terms of the UK's role in the world and the context in which the UK is engaging with the wider world. Could you give some reflection on that between the diplomatic service that you entered when you entered it, as opposed to the position that they're in now, in terms of Britain's role in the world, Britain's relationship to a changing global context?
Yeah, I think it's... Preparing for this conversation really sort of focused my mind a bit on this and how things had changed. In 1989 was the year I joined the Foreign Office, and that year was the year that the Berlin Wall fell. Tiananmen Square happened. And the fall of the Berlin Wall sort of indicated the end of an ideological battle, however you care to call it, where you'd had these two models. and one of them had won. And that, it was the democratic model had won. That was how it seemed at the time. And in the subsequent years, it really looked like, as I'll call it the West, for want of a better phrase, but I hope people will understand that. The West was ascendant. And so you had the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe queuing up to join the European Union. You had a US-led international coalition kicking Saddam Hussein out of reversing his invasion of Kuwait. You had in, 94, Nelson Mandela was elected as the democratically elected president in South Africa. And it wasn't a golden period. The Balkans was going on. No sooner had Nelson Mandela got elected, we started to hear about this genocide in Rwanda. But nevertheless, as the environment that I was working in, all the colleagues that I was working with, was of the ideological win, as it were. You fast forward that to 2020 when I left, and democracy and accountability and the rule of law and individual freedoms are really under attack. And it's really under attack. And they're under attack externally from countries that are trying, for example, to undermine the strength of those democratic countries and groups. Very interesting, very topically today, we have this standoff at the border between Poland and Belarus, and a lot of credible reports, well, it's actually the Russian government behind this. Why are they doing that? It's destabilizing, amongst other things, destabilizing the European Union. You have, and that's just one example of that. Separately, you have the attacks, as it were, from within democracies. So I think the confidence of the West has been shaken because talking there about some of the better times. But look, we've had Iraq, we've had Afghanistan, we've had a financial crisis that, according to the experts, was entirely predictable. It was coming, and yet all the institutions failed to deal with that. You then have an administration in the US, the last administration, which actually went for some of those institutions, like the independent judiciary, tried to undermine those, to look from within. And you saw international agreements being ripped up, not just by that administration, but that sort of clown car administration racing around Washington, doing these things. But this is when, what happened after the attack on the Capitol building and the fact that Donald Trump and his people had rejected the election result and said it was fixed. Well, less than a couple of months later in Myanmar, the generals take power. Now, they would probably have done that anyway, but what was the justification they gave? The election was fixed. So this is how delicate this, and how we've really now got to restore the confidence in democracy. And I think this is the key role now for the UK and countries like the UK, because it's not just about democratic government, it's about representative government, it's about individual freedoms, it's about the rule of law. And you've not only got to support those within your own country, but if you believe these are values that are worth, that are global, then you've got to be confident to project them on a global stage. And you can't do that if you or others, like-minded others, are trying to undermine them.
Andrew, thank you. You've raised a lot of really important issues there, which has been really worthwhile hearing, and those insights are incredibly valuable. We've got questions coming in. Please do keep them coming in, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. First question from Ethna Fitzgerald, who says, welcome back to Ireland. What would your top tips be for someone starting out in a career in the diplomatic corps? What would your top tips be for someone starting out in a career in the diplomatic corps?
Well, thank you to Ethna for that question and for the welcome back to Ireland. I think the first rather flippant one would be a bit of self-discipline on the eating and drinking. I think that would be a good thing. And as you can see, there's a reason why I'm giving that advice. I think for somebody starting out, it's a brilliant career. I really enjoyed it. You need to be clear-eyed about it. The reason it's brilliant is the issues you deal with and the chance to, even if the postings you have are less dramatic than some of the things we've been talking about here, which some of mine were, you get a chance to live in a different country and walk in the shoes of the people of that country and understand it in a way that you didn't when you arrived there. And that has been massively helpful for me, just to see the world from a different end of the telescope, as it were. I think the challenges of it is when Jane and I went out for our first posting in Caracas in the early 90s. I mean, it was just fun. I mean, the job was great, the place was great. We didn't have children. We went out and it was fantastic. But, you know, a career like that, one of the difficult, you get a family, you have to shift your family around. And, you know, it's very difficult for both of you to have a career and issues like that. But I think the upside of it is the issues that you deal with, and the chance to experience a different way of life. I wouldn't have swapped it for the world. I'm not sure my wife and daughter would give the same answer, but well, they might.
Thank you, Andy. Question here from Richard Hargy, this is a question about the period leading up to the St Andrews Agreement. It says, in the period leading up to the St Andrews Agreement and the actual negotiations and the period immediately after, could you reflect on the role of the US administration? So the role of the US in the build-up to and the implementation of the St Andrews Agreement.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that the US has been an incredibly powerful force throughout in, not just actually in the St Andrews Agreement, but before then. It felt that the pressure that they were applying and the cajoling and encouraging that they were doing was incredibly important. From where I sat, it felt that their role was less, and I don't think it was central on the Good Friday Agreement. I think it was a more proactive role with the Good Friday Agreement rather than the St Andrews Agreement. For me, the thing that the Americans had an important role, I think, in convening and, as I say, encouraging. But what really struck me about the St Andrews Agreement and the approach to that was something which coming to it in 2005 and seeing what the people in the Taoiseach's office and in Number 10 and the NIO and other players are doing, was the resilience of those and the determination of those people. Didn't matter how many setbacks came, ones that frankly must have made them think at times, you know, well, there's no coming back from this, but they didn't, and they persisted, and they got the agreement. And so for me, if the question is about the American role, which, as I say, from my own perspective, seemed to be important, but slightly less central than it was for the Good Friday Agreement, what really, I think, made that agreement happen was that persistence of people, including, for example, the person who was in the chair here the last time I saw this, Jonathan Powell, but I'm sure he would be the first to give credit to the others as well. And they never let what appeared to be often insuperable difficulties and setbacks become that, and they kept going.
And on that, Andy, does that persistence in the fate of uncertainty, contingency, setbacks, difficulties, does that give you hope for some of the future possibilities for resolving antagonisms which there are in the current context? Because there's obviously a series of difficulties between the UK and Ireland, between the UK and the European Union and so forth. But that capacity of people to produce the, at times, seemingly unthinkable breakthrough, is that something where you would be broadly an optimist, or have things changed to such a degree that that's been dampened?
No, I would remain optimistic about it. And actually, you know, you don't have to look that far back. Just, I mean, if you take the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, and that was 1 year after the Brighton bombing, very few years after the hunger strikes, a couple of years after the Security Council being called by then Ireland as a member of the Security Council after the Belgrano was signed, you know, to then get to, in 1985, an Anglo-Irish agreement, which was in its own way just as groundbreaking and surprising as some of the things that we've been talking about that followed, to the point that you said, you know, it was a good time to go to Dublin. It was, for me, in 2005, a very good time to go to Dublin. Because, you know, and the groundwork that had been laid there by the Good Friday Agreement. But, you know, if I'd stepped into the embassy in 1981, I wouldn't have expected that I might have been there long enough to see the Anglo-Irish Agreement signed. So I am optimistic about that. Where I feel worried about it is that anyone who has followed this at all realizes the importance of tone and the importance of sensitivity and a sense of understanding why these current undercurrents are undercurrents in this London-Dublin relationship. And I think, so I am very optimistic. Look, was it 10 years ago the Queen did the state visit to Dublin? You know, amazing. And Michael D was out in 2014 in London. This is a much stronger relationship than it was before. That's the grounds for the optimism, but it mustn't be taken for granted. And I think there's a risk of that. Because however good and optimistic I might be about the long term, there's a lot that could happen in the short and medium term to make that longer term, push that longer term back further into the distance.
Thank you. The next question relates to something which you just mentioned, probably in terms of tone, or at least partly. And the question from the questioner is this: does the current UK posture towards Brexit impinge on the effectiveness of the FCO? Does the current UK posture towards Brexit impinge on the effectiveness of the FCO?
I wouldn't use the word impinge, because actually what we had, you know, when I arrived in Hong Kong, I got the job in 2015, pre-referendum. I went out in September of 2016, 2 or 3 months post-referendum. At that point, you know, the work of the Foreign Office then was to deal with Brexit. And the reaction in Hong Kong, I think, was very interesting at that point, because I was expecting to go and see. There's a big inward investment. There's a great deal of investment from Hong Kong in the UK, and this was something, you know, part of my job and my team's job was to keep that going. I said, oh my God, it's going to be tougher now with Brexit. In fact, the reaction we got was, that's a bit weird. Why did people vote that way? So you did your best to explain it. But and I then said, well, you know, so how will this affect your investment decision? Well, no, not really at all. You know, if the rule of, you know, there's a rule of law, there's a good employment environment for us in the UK. People like going there because the education is good. So I was quite surprised to find that in this, you know, Hong Kong is a different market to others. So it doesn't impinge on the work because you have to just deal with it. What I do think, though, was that something which did damage, now that I've left government, I can perhaps be clearer, be more frank about this. You know, we spent a lot of time trying to explain why it was that we had this Brexit vote and now we suddenly had this political madhouse going on. And Britain's reputation, it suffered in a lot of respects because it seemed like a place that was renowned for being sensible and pragmatic suddenly was entering this huge convulsion, political convulsion, and prime ministers were falling and parliamentary votes were going in bizarre directions and nobody quite knew what was going to happen. There were some positives from it, and people, I mean, got really interested in the UK Parliament. I mean, people would say, God, this guy John Bercow, he's really interesting, and I heard X, you know, so there was, suddenly the parliamentary channel had a lot of subscribers out in Hong Kong. But it was, you know, firstly, you deal with the government of the day and their policy, and that was a government that did Brexit. So it didn't impinge on our work, it was part of it. It did have some issues for the effectiveness of what we did.
And do you think, Andy, that shift in the perception of the UK and to some extent reputational damage is likely to prove enduring?
I don't. I think it doesn't need to. I think if people see, this is where it's so important, you know, when I talked about democracy being attacked from the inside, I do think it's so important that countries, and I'm not just talking about the UK here, but keeping to international commitments, respecting the rule of law, respecting parliamentary democracy, all of these things are really important. You've got to walk the walk on that. And so I think that people now, they overseas, certainly from my experience in Hong Kong and the overseas contacts I have, I think they've accepted, okay, Brexit's happened, it's a thing, and we can see, yeah, there could be some good things that come out of this. But they do want to see that Britain is still the same Britain coming out of the other side, which is one that is believed to be pragmatic, where freedoms matter, where the rule of law matters, and where Britain keeps to its commitments. And I have no reason to think that that wouldn't happen, but they are watching that carefully.
Thank you. Next question is this: how should diplomatic services respond to the practicalities of COP26 and air travel? How should diplomatic services respond to the practicalities of COP26 and air travel?
It's a very good question, and one that I wish I had a better answer than well, possibly think about taking fewer flights. I mean, I suspect that in practical terms, diplomats and diplomatic services can achieve a great deal more by the work they do on the ground to make real inroads into implementing what emerges out of this. One thing I would say is I think in diplomacy, as in other walks of life, the use of the video conference has now become a very different thing. So, for example, every year there was a leadership conference in London. So all of the consul generals and ambassadors, we were all called back to be reprogrammed with whatever it was that was the latest priorities in the Foreign Office. Now, I don't know, that usually takes place in the summer. For the last couple of years, because of COVID, it hasn't happened, or it's been done virtually. Now, I don't know what will happen in 2022, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if that became a virtual conference. And that became a virtual conference because of this, because, well, it's something which we're thinking about in a different way. But I do think, while, the other part of this is that, partly in response to Ethna Fitzgerald's question, you're a long way from home in a lot of these places, and it isn't conceivable not to fly, to come back and see family and to get home. You've got to use flights, but probably people will be more aware of doing that less now.
Thank you. A question here from a Mitchell Institute colleague, Zahir Kazmi. And he says, diplomats consume a range of information and analysis daily. What was your personal experience of the value or relevance of academic expertise to policymaking? What was your personal experience of the value or relevance of academic expertise to policymaking?
This is a point I feel very strongly about, and it's a really good question. I think the fact is it's not harnessed nearly enough. And part of that is getting back to this reactive 24-hour news cycle, all of these things that are flying at you and diplomatic colleagues all the time. So there are two parts to it. I think, firstly, as a diplomat, I look back and think I wish I'd worked harder to really made an effort to make time to read about so many of these, they're the best of the work that was relevant to where I was. I feel that colleagues would often say, there's a really good report out from the Mitchell Institute. We should have a look at this. And then that was great if somebody flagged it up. But it didn't happen by osmosis. I think maybe academic institutes, I very rarely actually received something as the ambassador in Myanmar or Consul General in Hong Kong saying, "Dear Consul General, this is something we produced." So I would commend people to do that. But the other thing which I think is a real shame is there's so little interchange between the two. So I think, academics and think tank experts have so much to offer the Foreign Office and have so much to offer potentially diplomatic missions as well, if the logistics can be made to work. And I also think diplomats have a great deal to offer in the other direction. And I wish that interchange, you see it much more in the States, I wish that interchange were a bit more fluid than it is now.
And one of the hopes that we have at the Mitchell Institute, involving people like yourself, Andy, is to try and make sure that there is that set of relationships and dialogue, the kind of thing we're doing now, where people can engage in listening to your expertise as a professional from the diplomatic world, but also engaging in the opportunity for dialogue in all directions. So I hope that the Mitchell Institute will make its own small contribution there. A question here which takes us back to Hong Kong, and it's a question about when you were Consul General, the pressures you received from different sides, countervailing pressures from the pro-democracy politicians, activists, from the central Chinese government. Can you say something about how you dealt with and how one in your business deals with the kinds of pressures you received then from countervailing forces in moments of intense crisis and antagonism?
Yeah, it's a very important part of the job, and actually particularly so during my time in Hong Kong, where the first thing that an overseas mission can do is it has a power to convene, which you can use for good. So to give an example, we used to have in the LegCo, there would be the pro-democracy group and there'd be the so-called pro-establishment group. And when I got to, when I was preparing to go out to Hong Kong and talk to my predecessor, she said to me, one of the things that you may be surprised to know is these guys don't really talk to each other. It's not like, I don't know how it is in the House of Commons, but it used to be once you're off the floor of the House, the opposition and government MPs kind of mucked in. This didn't happen. And in fact, so if you host an event or a lunch or whatever, or a dinner, they will talk to each other in a way that gives them this gives neutral ground on which they can discuss. Where it gets difficult is that you then become, when they're having their arguments, you're the proxy for the argument. So it's, well, Consul General, you would agree with me, wouldn't you, that the other side are completely outrageous, and the only way you could deal with that, well, I think they can speak for themselves on that and try to stay out. But it does become difficult, and I think particularly in Hong Kong, it was a place where actually, not unlike, I never had a diplomatic role here for obvious reasons, but where you had to be very careful the words you use publicly, because people were very ready to leap on them to say either to use them for in support of their arguments or indeed against. So it was a play. I had to be more careful there, I think, than almost anywhere I'd been in the language I used publicly.
Thank you, Andy. Question here, which brings us back to Northern Ireland, to the UK and Ireland. Has the Good Friday Agreement reached its use-by date? Has the Good Friday Agreement reached its use-by date?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I think like any agreement, it's got to evolve. I mean, it's now, I have to get my maths right, but you're 20 years on plus, and so it needs to evolve and adapt to the current circumstances and the new circumstances. But as a structure for power sharing and government by consent, it feels to me like it's every bit as relevant today as it was when it was signed. And it needs to be, but I think if it fails to evolve, then yes, I would agree. I think the sell-by date would be an issue, because if it stays frozen in time, my sense is it will no longer be fit for purpose. But it needs to evolve, and that needs to be done with consent. But no, I don't think it's reached the sell-by date.
And one of the key things about the process in Northern Ireland, wasn't it, was that it was always a process, that there was something where there wasn't a final moment where a problem was solved or a question was decisively answered once and for all, but it was always about relationships and evolution and process. So, thank you. There's a question here prompted by the takeover of Newcastle United Football Club, but relating to previous insights into the relevant states. And the question is, does that kind of thing suggest that the UK government should change its position on dealing with regimes such as the Saudi government? So UK policy in regard to states with human rights records that are dubious and prompted, though, by the takeover of a famous football club.
Well, I mean, Richard, I'm a football fan, and so I thought it was really interesting to see the way that the Newcastle takeover played out, in a way that actually, if you look at some of the controlling interests in some of the other clubs, I could see why the Newcastle fans, I think slightly ironically, said we finally got our club back, which I thought was a bit strange, but okay. But I think what they meant was they got it back from the person who was there before. But how they were, when people were putting to them, well, are you happy that this group is taking over? They were saying, well, what about here and there? So I reckon this is one. I think the fundamental part of diplomacy is how you calibrate your engagement. I've very rarely seen disengagement work to actually achieve change, and that's said from somebody who worked in Myanmar, where Myanmar was pretty well cut off for the 50 years before it opened up under military rule. And in the end, what brought about, there were a number of reasons for the change, but in the end, what brought it about was a very calibrated engagement leading to the reforms that came in. And of course, these weren't only the external factors, but the external factors did matter. So not just because of that, but in general, I do believe very strongly in engaging. And I think, again, we've just had this agreement between the US and China, who are at loggerheads on so many issues, but they've come together on something that is really important on climate change. I think where it gets messy and where I can understand it, people criticizing, is if the relationship seems to be based about money. If it's all about money. Well, there's a case for that, because the contracts can mean jobs in the UK, for example. But if, on the other hand, the relationship is deeper than that and wider than that, which in my experience, cynical as you get in 30 years in any organization, but if the relationship is wider than that, and there is actually a dialogue going on that is clear that, look, we could do so much more here, but it's very difficult to do it when your record on minorities or on immigrant labour is how it is. But I don't think that's a reason to disengage. And I think what will be interesting is looking at, for example, the World Cup in Qatar and how the Qataris are clearly, there's not arguing there isn't a long way to go, but they are clearly, with the World Cup coming, thinking, you've got the eyes of the world on us here and making changes that it's arguable might not have happened without the World Cup coming. Whether, again, what's happened with this takeover of Newcastle leads to a rethink or an acceleration of some of the reforms going on in Saudi Arabia, we'll see. It is difficult, but I would very much argue against disengagement because we just find this, we can't live with that. I don't think that's helping the people you're trying to help.
You mentioned, you said, I think, however cynical one gets after 30 years in diplomatic service. I'm going to follow up on that. But have you changed significantly? I mean, has the career changed your outlook on the kind of politics you thought you were getting involved with when you first joined in 1989, or have you remained broadly consistent in your approach, response, outlook?
Yeah. I remember in my first posting in Caracas, there was a leaving party for somebody. And the person who was leaving was an old-timer, and who was basically, I'm 59 now, he was probably 59 then, and he was leaving, and it was a leaving party, and he came out and said, so you've just arrived in the embassy? And I said, yeah, he's a second secretary political. And we both had a glass of wine. He said, I don't envy you. I wouldn't want to join this foreign office. And I remember just thinking, what? I'm thrilled to be in this foreign office. And so I've always sort of had that in my mind that, for him, it had run its course, and it was a horrible place to work now because it wasn't like it was 30 years before when he joined, when it was better. But he probably was just as enthusiastic then. There are things about working in foreign policy now that I find, or did find, difficult, as well as leaving an organisation that I really enjoyed and I felt got a lot from. I hope I gave something back to. I mean, anyone who's watching this after the event in Hong Kong will know I'm about to start talking about Twitter. Twitter has its place. I don't think it's a tool of foreign policy. It drives me bonkers when I see our response to something is a tweet, apparently from the Foreign Secretary. That's clearly not been written by the Foreign Secretary. It's probably been written by whoever drafts the Foreign Secretary's tweets. And I don't think that's how you should do foreign policy. Maybe bits of it have its place, maybe, but I think foreign policy it doesn't lend itself to this. If you're going to say something, put out a statement. Old style, you can put on Twitter, we put out a statement and read it. But I found that part of it, and the pressure on diplomats to tweet. Some of them are delighted to do it and do it pretty well, others less well. But I remember I asked David Cameron when he came out to Burma, and I was getting a bit of pressure from the FCO. He was embracing the Twitter age. This would have been in 2012, I guess. And he came out, and I said to him, look, what do you think? Do you use Twitter? And he launched a diatribe similar to the one I've just done, and I thought, yeah, okay, I kind of agree with that. In fact, he used much more colourful language. But I do think the part of foreign policy that's very reactive and doesn't allow time to. Twitter's just the sort of the embodiment of it to me, but it doesn't allow time to step back and think about where do you want this to be? Where do we want to be? If we've got this policy, where do we want to be on this in a couple of years' time? What are we doing now that might impact on that? I wish there was more time for that.
Thank you. And thanks for all the great questions that have come in. We've got time to get through a few more of them. The next question is, which was your favourite posting and why?
Oh dear, right. I'm in Ireland, Dublin. They're all different. I mean, I'll answer that as briefly as I possibly can. Caracas was amazing because we'd been abroad, but we'd never lived abroad before. And we were learning a language for the same time. And, I was second secretary, so you had responsibility, but it wasn't the responsibility like being an ambassador. And I had a great ambassador there. Giles Fitzherbert really gave me my wings, as it were, and let me do things. And Jane and I had a ball there. I think Dublin was truly fantastic because of the friends we made there, and friends who are, I'm sure, lifelong friends. And it was a great place for us as a family. Work-wise, it was hard to beat Myanmar and Hong Kong. because both of them, you were in the eye of the storm. I mean, it was exhausting. I probably would have lots of grey hair anyway, but it was exhausting, but it was incredibly stimulating and motivating to know that what you were sending back was being read and it mattered, and to work with people who felt the same. And as I say, in both places, I had people around me who were just brilliant, and that was really enjoyable. So all of them, there's a diplomatic answer. I didn't mention Portugal, that was great as well.
Well, the next question maybe also requires a diplomatic answer, but academic freedom means you can give an answer which is honest. And the question is, which of the UK politicians you've dealt with has most impressed you?
That's a very good question. Okay, no, I'll give a straight answer here. I would say the two who were the most impressive in terms of how they presented themselves were Tony Blair and William Hague. They were, you could see in both cases there was a great deal of depth. Their ability to express a concept and listen was, I found, really impressive. David Miliband I saw less of, and what I saw was pretty good. But Tony Blair visited Burma. He came as post-prime ministerial Tony Blair, and you saw him when he was in the meeting room, whether it was with the president of Myanmar or with the then leader of the opposition, Aung San Suu Kyi. It's like there was a wavelength he picked up, and that sort of empathy, I suppose, that he was very skillful at projecting. And William Hague was mainly because he was just so, and I was actually quite, when he came out as Foreign Secretary, I was a bit wary what he would be like. But he was warm, he was appreciative. Again, he gathered information in a way that I found really impressive. You could tell, not just with me, he was listening very hard. And what I really took to was when I was talking to him about, he was talking about campaigning in the election. And he said, what I really like doing is going out and meeting people when I'm talking about my books. And he was prepared to open up in that way, which I found, if you're in a car for hours, as you were in Burma, traveling up 5 hours from Rangoon to the capital in the middle of nowhere, Naypyidaw, both of them were really interesting to meet.
The final question is one which brings us back to Northern Ireland. This is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of Northern Ireland. Are commemorations more of a help than a hindrance politically?
Wow, okay, that's the last question, my goodness.
Yeah, I'd like to end with the Jeremy Paxman.
I thought you might give me yes, what's your favourite food? I mean, what has struck me about commemorations is they clearly do matter. They can become a focus for discontent. It feels here that in Northern Ireland is a place where they're very important. And I see a huge amount of effort, I'm looking from the outside now, but I see a huge amount of effort going in to trying to make, for the most part, commemorations inclusive and less in the face of the other part of the community. But there are times of the year, I will be very diplomatic and avoid the question. There are times of the year where you think, is that what's going on there? I understand you've got to celebrate whatever the thing might be. Is there enough sensitivity to the other side of the community in the doing of that? But for the most part, when you consider all of the potential flashpoints that are here, there is a real sense, I think, that people want to, I get as an outsider, that people really want to make it work and not let the old divisions. There will be some people who are very attached to them and will keep worrying at them. But, there's a generation, thinking back to the Good Friday Agreement in 98, there's a generation of people who've grown up not seeing soldiers outside shops and not hearing about the latest. But, there's a moving on going on there. So maybe part of it is that the significance will start they remain important, but maybe the significance will begin to reduce over time, and therefore there'll be less of a cause for friction.
It's time for us to bring this fascinating conversation to an end. 3 words of thanks before we close. First of all, thanks to you in the audience. We got through many of the questions, but not all of them. But thank you very much for the range and perceptiveness of the questions. I hope that you'll keep being involved in Mitchell Institute events. Look at the website, find the things that you find most exciting and get involved with them, and we look forward to your engagement. But thank you to the audience. This has been jointly organised by the Mitchell Institute and by Public Engagement at Queen's. I'd like to offer a profound word of thanks to colleagues in the Institute and colleagues in Public Engagement for making this possible. It's been a terrific event, but particularly for the wonderful insights across a wide range of questions, a wide range of aspects of his career, for the many insights you've offered us tonight. I'm sure everyone would want me to thank, and everyone would want to join me in thanking our distinguished guest tonight, Professor Andrew Heyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard.